You ever get a letter you wish you'd never read? Not because it's bad news, but because it's a map to a place you ain't built to survive. In the winter of 1889, a woman named Hattie Carver held a letter like that, a response to an ad she'd answered on a lonely Tuesday. The ad was for a mail-order bride from a rancher up in the Montana mountains, a man named Silas Boone. He was described as large, gruff, and widowed. He was lonely. Hattie, 50 years old and twice as tired, understood lonely. In her letter, the one she wrote back, she poured out the parts of herself she kept locked away. Her love of quilting, her fear of storms, her secret belief that a hawk, flying all alone, was the bravest creature God ever made. She wrote about the quiet strength it takes to mend things other people break. But Hattie never sent it. She couldn't. Fear, you see, is a powerful anchor. She figured a man like Silas Boone wanted a pretty young thing, not a woman whose face was more roadmap than meadow. But her younger sister, Ruthie, she wasn't afraid of anything. Ruthie, with her sun-gold hair and a laugh that could charm a snake out of its skin, found the letter. And with the casual cruelty of the beautiful, she'd simply scratched out Hattie's name and penned her own at the bottom. "He'll never know the difference," Ruthie had chirped. "Besides, you're not really the marrying kind, are you, Hat?" Those words had been a knife, twisted slow. So Ruthie went. She married Silas Boone, and for 20 years, Hattie Carver stayed in the quiet town of Flat Willow, becoming a ghost in her own life. She nursed the sick, mended the town's socks, and buried her own heart under a mountain of duty. Then one morning, a letter arrived, not for her, but about her sister. Ruthie was dead. Fever, the note said, but tucked inside was a smaller, crumpled piece of paper, stained and torn. It was in Ruthie's frantic scrawl. "If anything happens, tell Silas the truth. Tell him it was Hattie he wrote to first. Tell him to look under the floorboard." The wind changed that afternoon, and for the first time in 20 years, Hattie packed a bag. Not for a wedding, but for a reckoning. Some truths wait decades to be spoken, and some secrets are buried for a reason. What she thought she was riding toward was a grieving widower and an awkward confession. What she was really riding toward was a house of shadows, a man with eyes as cold as a winter grave, and a secret under the floorboards that was going to change everything she thought she knew about her sister, about Silas Boone, and about the real reason a man like that asked for a bride in the mail. This isn't the story you think it is, because Ruthie didn't die of a fever, and Silas Boone wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for someone just like Hattie, and he'd been waiting a long, long time. The ride to the Boone estate felt like climbing into the sky's attic, all dust and forgotten things. The trail got narrower, the air thinner, and the trees clawed at her cloak like bony fingers. Hattie's old mare, Mercy, huffed, her breath pluming in the cold. With every step, Hattie rehearsed the words. "Mr. Boone, I'm Hattie Carver. My sister Ruthie, she took my place." It sounded foolish. It sounded impossible. By the time she saw the ranch, dusk was bleeding all over the mountains. The place wasn't just lonely, it was wounded. The fence sagged. The barn looked like a skeleton. In the main house, 2 stories of dark timber had a single yellow light burning in one window, like the eye of a predator. She dismounted, her bones screaming from the journey. The air was dead silent. No cattle, no dogs, not even the chirp of a cricket. She walked to the porch, each footfall booming in the quiet, and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the wood. For a long moment, nothing. Then the door creaked open. He was bigger than the ad described. A mountain of a man, with a beard like iron shavings and eyes that weren't sad or lonely. They were sharp and empty. They looked right through her. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he rumbled. The word ma'am hit her like a stone. "I'm Hattie Carver," she stammered, her practiced speech gone. "Ruthie's sister." A flicker, not of pain, not of surprise. It was recognition, a cold, knowing spark that made the hair on her arm stand up. He opened the door wider, a silent invitation into the shadows. Inside, the house smelled of pine ash, old leather, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely sweet, like old blood. It was a man's space, tidy but unloved. He gestured to a chair by the cold hearth. She left something for you, Hattie said, her voice trembling. A note. She wanted me to tell you the truth. She watched his face, expecting shock, maybe anger. Instead, his expression remained perfectly, unnervingly still. The letters, she pushed on, her heart hammering. The ones you received 20 years ago. They were from me. Ruthie. She pretended to be me. Silas Boone just stood there, his massive form blotting out the light from the doorway. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until Hattie felt like she was suffocating. She expected him to rage, to throw her out. But he didn't. He finally moved, shutting the door with a soft, final click. He turned and a thin, chilling smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. I know, he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. I've been waiting for you, Hattie. The world tilted. Waiting for her? How could he possibly know? Ruthie's note wasn't a confession. It was a summons. And Hattie had just walked right into the trap. She wasn't here to explain the past. She was here because Silas Boone wanted something from the woman who wrote those letters. And looking at the cold, hard set of his jaw, she realized he was a man who always got what he wanted. Fear has a taste. It tastes like copper pennies in cold ash. Hattie sat frozen in the chair, the man's words echoing in the oppressive quiet of the room. Waiting for me? She whispered. How? Silas moved toward the hearth, his steps heavy, deliberate. He didn't light a fire. He just stood with his back to it, a giant silhouette against the dying light from the window. Your letters, Hattie. They weren't like the others. Others? The words slipped out, a squeak of pure terror. Oh, yes, he said, his voice conversational, which was somehow more frightening than a shout. Before Ruthie, there were others who answered the ad. Flighty things, full of poetry and nonsense. But your letters, they were different. You wrote about mending things, about knowing which herbs calm a fever and which ones can stop a heart. Hattie's blood ran cold. She had written that. She'd been a nurse for 30 years. She'd written about the fine line between healing and hurting, about the power in a woman's hands. She thought she was being profound. She hadn't realized she was writing a resume. You wrote about hawks, he continued, turning his head slightly. His eyes caught the lamplight, glinting like chips of ice. How they see everything from above, how they have no master. I admired that. This was a nightmare. This man hadn't been looking for love. He'd been vetting candidates. He'd been searching for a specific set of skills. But for what? Suddenly, Ruthie's lie didn't seem like a cruel prank anymore. It seemed like a desperate act of self-preservation. She must have realized what Silas was the moment she arrived. Pretty flighty Ruthie, who couldn't boil water without burning it, would have been useless to him. What had happened in this house over the last 20 years? Where is my sister buried? Hattie asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Buried? She's not buried. Hattie's heart stopped. Not buried? The fever took her quick, he said smoothly. The ground is frozen solid. Had to take her down to the old ice house behind the barn. She's waiting for the spring thaw. The image was grotesque. Her sister preserved in a block of ice, waiting in the dark. It wasn't right. Nothing about this was right. Hattie stood up, her legs shaking. I should go. I've delivered my message. No, he said, the single word a steel bar locking her in place. You've only just arrived. You haven't seen the real reason you're here. He gestured toward a heavy oak door at the far end of the room, a door she hadn't noticed before. It had 3 iron bolts slid across it. Ruthie was a disappointment, Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She had none of your talents, none of your resilience. But you, Hattie, you're the one I chose. You're the one who can help me. He started walking toward her. Help you with what? She breathed, backing away until her shoulders hit the rough log wall. He smiled again, that same dead-eyed smile. With my first wife. Hattie stared, confused. Your first wife? I thought she died years ago. Silas reached the bolted door. His hand rested on the top bolt. Oh, she did, he said, his voice filled with a strange, chilling reverence. But she never left. With a grunt, He slid back the first heavy bolt. Thunk, then the second. Thunk, then the third. Thunk. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the smell of dust and decay, and something else. Lavender and rot. He pulled the door open, and Hattie Carver finally understood. She wasn't a guest. She was a replacement, and the job she was here to do was something no sane person would ever agree to. Because Silas Boone wasn't a widower. Not really. He was a keeper. The room behind the door wasn't a room. It was a shrine and a prison. The air that rolled out was thick and cloying, a sweet, chemical smell layered over the must of decay. Hattie gagged, pressing a hand to her mouth. In the center of the room, on a large four-poster bed, lay a woman, or what was left of a woman. She was propped up on lace pillows, her skin a waxy, translucent white, like a porcelain doll left out in the rain. Her eyes were closed, her hands folded peacefully over a silk blanket. But this was no peaceful sleep. This was a state of perfect, horrifying preservation. Hattie was a nurse. She knew death, and she knew what it took to stop it, or at least to pause its gruesome work. Arsenic, formaldehyde, a careful, constant application of preserving agents. The woman on the bed hadn't just died. She'd been curated. "This is Elspeth," Silas said, his voice soft with a grotesque tenderness. "My first love. My true wife." Hattie couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The sweet smell was the scent of embalming fluids. Silas had turned his dead wife into a permanent fixture in his home. "She took ill," Silas explained as if discussing the weather. "A wasting sickness. The doctors could do nothing. But I couldn't let her go. I found a way to keep her with me." His gaze shifted from the macabre doll on the bed to Hattie. His eyes were glowing with a feverish intensity. "But the process is delicate. It requires constant upkeep, a knowledgeable hand. Ruthie. She was clumsy. She had no feel for the chemicals. She almost ruined my Elspeth." It all clicked into place with the sickening snap of a breaking bone. The ad, the specific questions in his letters. He wasn't looking for a companion. He was looking for a mortician, a private live-in caretaker for his wife's corpse. Hattie felt a wave of nausea so profound she thought she would faint. This was a madness beyond anything she could have imagined. What had Ruthie endured for 20 years, trapped in this house with this man and his dead bride? The fear in her final, scribbled note was now terrifyingly clear. Tell him to look under the floorboard. It wasn't about a secret stash of money. It was a clue, a desperate final message. I can't," Hattie whispered, her voice a raw thread. "I'm a nurse. I heal the living." Silas's expression hardened. The soft, reverent tone vanished, replaced by cold command. "You are what I say you are. You are the woman who wrote those letters, the woman who understands the chemistry of life and death. Ruthie was a placeholder, a failed experiment. You are the solution." He took a step closer, and Hattie saw the raw power coiled in his shoulders. There was no escaping this ranch. The nearest town was a day's ride away, and no one knew she was here. She was utterly, completely alone with a madman and his two wives, one dead, one a terrified replacement. "Every week," Silas said, his voice returning to that eerie instructional calm, "we will tend to her. You will learn the mixtures. You will care for her as I have. You are part of this family now, Hattie." He saw the mutiny in her eyes. "Don't think of running," he warned, his voice a low growl. "The mountains are treacherous, and beside," he added, a cruel glint in his eye, "I took the liberty of laming your horse. Mercy won't be taking you anywhere." Her blood froze. Mercy, her steady, loyal companion. He hadn't just trapped her. He'd crippled her, only means of escape. She was his prisoner, forced to participate in this unspeakable ritual. But as the despair threatened to swallow her whole, Ruthie's words echoed again. "Look under the floorboard." Her sister had left her something. A weapon, a key, an answer. Ruthie hadn't just died. She had fought back, and now it was Hattie's turn. She had to play along. She had to survive. She had to find what her sister had hidden. She looked from the terrifying figure of Silas to the waxy corpse of Elspeth, and for the first time she forced herself to meet his gaze. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Show me what I need to do," she said, her voice dripping with a false submission that tasted like poison on her tongue. The game had begun, and Hattie Carver, the woman no one ever noticed, was about to become the most dangerous player. The days that followed were a waking nightmare, painted in shades of gray. The sky was a pewter lid clamped over the mountains. The house was a tomb, and Silas was its ever-watchful warden. He made Hattie sleep in Ruthie's old room, a small, cold space at the back of the house. The first night, Hattie didn't sleep. She waited until the sounds of the house settled, until Silas's heavy footsteps ceased their pacing in the hall. Then, by the faint light of a slivered moon, she began her search. Ruthie's room was sparse. A narrow bed, a rickety wardrobe, a small washstand. There was nothing of her sister's vibrant personality left, only the oppressive weight of Silas's control. Hattie ran her hands over every inch of the rough-hewn floorboards, pressing, listening for a hollow sound, a loose edge. Her fingers, chapped and sore, searched for a notch, a crack, anything. Nothing. She checked under the bed, behind the wardrobe. Nothing. Disappointment gnawed at her, sharp and bitter. Had she imagined the note's urgency? Had Ruthie's final message been nothing more than the ramblings of a fevered mind? No. Hattie knew her sister. Ruthie was careless, but she wasn't a fool. The message was real. The secret was here. She just hadn't found it yet. Her new reality began the next morning. Silas led her back to Elspeth's shrine. The sickly sweet smell was even stronger now, and Hattie had to fight the bile rising in her throat. Silas was all business, his grief a mask for a chillingly precise obsession. "The skin must be kept moist," he instructed, pointing to a collection of glass bottles and jars on a nearby table. "This mixture is for the hands and face. This one for the torso. You will apply it twice a day." Gently. Hattie forced her hands to be steady as she picked up a soft cloth. Her nursing experience, once a source of pride, now felt like a curse. She knew just enough about anatomy and preservation to understand the horrifying science behind Silas's madness. As she worked, applying the cold, oily liquids to the corpse's skin, she felt a profound and chilling connection to her sister. Ruthie must have done this every day for 20 years. Her hands must have touched this same cold skin. What kind of hell had that been? She watched Silas out of the corner of her eye. He observed her every move, his expression intense, proprietary. He wasn't just watching her work. He was judging her, measuring her against the woman from the letters, the woman he had invented in his mind. She had to be that woman. Calm, capable, unflinching. Her life depended on it. Later that day, while Silas was out in the barn, supposedly tending to the lame Mercy, Hattie tried again. She went back to Ruthie's room, her mind racing. Look under the floorboard. Not a floorboard, the floorboard. It had to be specific. She thought about her sister. Ruthie loved pretty things. She was vain. She would have spent hours in front of the room's only mirror, a small, cracked oval hanging above the washstand. Hattie walked over to the washstand and stared at her own reflection. A tired, frightened woman stared back. She looked down. The floorboards directly under the stand were no different from the others. But then she noticed it. A small, dark stain on the floor, right where someone would stand. A scuff mark? No. It was a burn. A tiny, deliberate black circle, no bigger than a coin. As if someone had pressed a hot poker to the wood. Her heart leaped. It was a marker. Kneeling down, she examined the board. There, on the edge, almost invisible, was a tiny notch. Using the tip of her nail file from her travel bag, she pried at it. The board groaned, then lifted. Beneath it was a small, hollow space, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thin leather-bound book. Ruthie's diary. Hattie's hands trembled as she pulled it out. This was it. This was the secret. She unwrapped it and opened to the first page. The handwriting was her sister's, but the words were terrifying. October 1869. I have arrived. The man Silas is not what I expected. There is a coldness in him. In the house, it holds its breath. He keeps his first wife's room locked. He says he is not ready to let her go. Hattie flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the frantic entries. The story of Ruthie's life unfolded, a story of isolation, fear, and growing dread. Then she found an entry from a year ago that made her blood turn to ice. He brought another one today, a girl from the town, Mary, said she was here to help with chores, but I saw the way he looked at her. He took her to the barn. I heard her scream. Just once. I found her bonnet near the woodpile this morning. He told me she ran off, homesick. He lies. He lies about everything. Hattie slammed the book shut, her heart pounding against her ribs. Silas wasn't just a madman preserving his wife. He was a predator, a killer. The other women who answered the ad, had they been failed experiments too? Had Ruthie been the only one he'd kept alive, a reluctant accomplice trapped by fear? She was reading the last testament of a witness to unspeakable evil. She flipped to the very last entry, dated just a week before her own arrival. The writing was weak, spidery. The fever is a lie. He gave me a tea, said it was for my cough. My hands are numb. I know what he is doing. He read Hattie's old letters again last night. He spoke her name. He is ready for her. I pray this finds you, sister. He is a collector of souls. Don't let him add yours to his collection. The sheriff is his brother. The diary slipped from her nerveless fingers. The sheriff. The law in the nearest town was his own family. There was no one to call for help. No one was coming. Ruthie hadn't died of a fever. She'd been poisoned, slowly, methodically, by her husband, to make way for her replacement, to make way for Hattie. The front door slammed shut. Silas was back. Hattie scrambled to hide the diary, her mind a whirlwind of terror. She had to get out. But how? He'd crippled her horse. The law was on his side. She was trapped on a mountain with a serial killer in his collection. The game had just changed. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about justice. For Ruthie, for Mary, for all the others. And Hattie Carver, the quiet nurse, would have to become something else entirely. She would have to become a hunter. The knowledge from the diary settled in Hattie's bones like a killing frost. Every move Silas made, every word he spoke, was now filtered through the horrifying truth. His calm demeanor wasn't madness. It was the chilling self-assurance of a predator who had never been caught. The way he hummed while chopping wood, the way he carefully mended a saddle, these were the ordinary actions of a monster. Hattie's fear didn't lessen, but it changed. It crystallized into a cold, hard diamond of purpose in her chest. She had to escape, but she couldn't just run. She had to destroy him. She had to find a way to expose him, to make the world see the devil hiding in plain sight. Her nursing skills, the very thing that had lured him, were now her only weapons. She knew chemistry, she knew anatomy, and she knew poison. The following days, she played her part with terrifying precision. She was the perfect, docile caretaker. She tended to the grotesque doll of Elspeth, her hands never shaking. She listened to Silas's long, rambling monologues about his dead wife, nodding in all the right places. She made him his meals, organized the pantry, and learned the rhythms of the house. She was gathering intelligence, mapping her prison. She learned that Silas rode into the town of Flat Willow every Friday to pick up supplies and mail. That was her window, a few hours of freedom within the confines of the ranch. The sheriff was his brother. Going to the law was a death sentence. She needed evidence. Hard, undeniable proof that no one, not even a corrupt brother, could ignore. The diary was a start, but it was her word against his. She needed something more. Her mind raced back to the diary entry. A girl from the town, Mary. I found her bonnet near the woodpile. During her first free afternoon, while Silas was checking his distant fence lines, Hattie went to the woodpile. It was a massive stack of timber, cords upon cords of wood, enough for a dozen brutal winters. It would be impossible to search it all, but she didn't have to. She thought like a nurse, like someone who understands the body. If you want to hide something, you hide it where the ground is already disturbed. She looked for the newest part of the stack, the logs split and thrown there most recently. Then she looked at the ground around it. In one spot, near the back, the earth was slightly darker, more compressed. She started digging with her bare hands, the cold soil biting at her fingers. It didn't take long. First, a piece of faded calico fabric, then a small polished bone, a human finger bone. She kept digging, her breath catching in her throat, until she uncovered the shallow grave of the girl named Mary. It was a gruesome, heartbreaking sight. Hattie forced herself to look, to bear witness. She found the rest of the skeleton, and near the skull, a small silver locket, tarnished but intact. She pried it open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a smiling young woman. Mary. This was her proof. She reburied the remains, carefully replacing the dirt and leaves. She pocketed the locket. It felt as heavy as a tombstone in her dress pocket. Now she had the what. She still needed the how. How could she get this evidence to someone who would believe her? Not the sheriff, someone else. In her original letter to Silas, the one he had cherished, she had mentioned her cousin, a U.S. Marshal based out of Helena, a man with a reputation for being stubborn, honest, and utterly relentless. His name was John Carver. Silas knew the name. He'd even commented on it once. "A man of the law in your family," he'd said. "That shows good breeding." He had no idea he was talking about the man who would eventually hang him. But Helena was days away. She couldn't get there. She needed to get a message out. The next Friday, as Silas prepared for his ride to town, Hattie feigned a headache. "I need some laudanum for the pain," she said, her voice weak. "And we're almost out of lye for the soap." It was a calculated risk. Silas was suspicious of everything, but her performance was flawless. He grunted, annoyed at the errand, but added the items to his list. While he was gone, she worked like a woman possessed. She went to Ruthie's diary and, using a needle, carefully pricked out a message in the inside cover, a simple code she and her cousin had used as children. Silas Boone, multiple murders, proof buried at woodpile, law compromised, come alone. H. Then came the most dangerous part. She needed to get the diary out of the house and into the mail. She couldn't just leave it for the postman. Silas always checked the mail pouch. She had to hide it in the supplies he was bringing back. She remembered the lie. It came in a thick paper sack. When Silas returned, he left the supplies on the kitchen table. As she unpacked them, her back to him, her hands moved with deft speed. She slit a small opening in the bottom seam of the lie sack, slid the thin diary inside, and pressed the seam closed. It was almost invisible. The diary was out. Now it was a waiting game. She had posted a letter to a hangman, using the killer as her messenger. The next week was the longest of her life. She lived on a knife's edge, terrified that Silas would discover the slit in the sack, that the diary would fall out, that her cousin would never get the message. She continued her macabre duties with Elspeth, her stomach in knots. One evening, as she was tending to the corpse, her hand brushed against the locket in her pocket. An idea sparked. A wicked, terrible, and perfect idea. Silas believed she was becoming one of them, a willing participant in his fantasy. It was time to give him what he wanted. "Silas," she said that night, her voice soft and steady, "Elspeth she is beautiful, but she must be lonely." He looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "I've been thinking," Hattie continued, the words tasting like acid, "a bride should not be without her handmaiden." She watched his expression shift from suspicion to a dawning, grotesque understanding. He was a collector, and she had just offered him a new piece for his collection. "Ruthie," Hattie whispered, letting a tear trace a path down her cheek. "She belongs here, with family." Silas stared at her, his mind clearly captivated by the horror and the beauty of the suggestion, to bring the sisters together, one as the caretaker, the other as a permanent companion for his beloved Elspeth. It was a twisted fantasy come to life. "The ice house," Silas breathed, his eyes wide with a feverish glee. "We can bring her up in the morning." Hattie nodded, a cold sense of triumph washing over her terror. She had just gained access to her sister's body, and she knew exactly what she was going to do. The spring thaw was coming, but Hattie Carver was about to bring her own kind of fire. The morning air was sharp and brittle as Silas led the way to the ice house. It was a squat, windowless building, half buried in the earth, its thick wooden door bound with a heavy iron chain. The smell of sawdust and frozen damp hit Hattie as Silas unbolted the door. Inside, it was dark and profoundly cold. Large blocks of ice, cut from a winter lake, were stacked along the walls, shrouded in sawdust. And in the center of the room, on a makeshift bier, was a long, canvas-wrapped bundle. Ruthie. Hattie's heart clenched. This was her sister, reduced to an object in a madman's collection. Silas approached the bundle with a grim reverence. "She was lighter than I expected," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Together they carried the frozen, rigid form back to the main house. They took her not to Elspeth's room, but to the adjoining spare room. Silas, in his twisted logic, had decided Ruthie should have her own space, as befitted a handmaiden. "We must let her thaw slowly," he instructed, his voice filled with the officious tone of a museum curator. "A rapid change in temperature would damage the tissue." He left Hattie alone with the body, ordering her to begin preparing the preservation mixtures. The moment the door closed, Hattie flew into action. She wasn't preparing preservatives. She was performing an autopsy. Her hands, trained for years to find the cause of sickness, now searched for the cause of death. As Ruthie's body slowly softened in the relative warmth of the room, Hattie examined her sister with a clinician's cold detachment, pushing her grief down deep. She checked her fingernails for signs of a struggle. She looked for bruises, for marks on her neck. Nothing. Silas was careful. Poison left few external traces. But Hattie knew what to look for. She lifted Ruthie's eyelids. The sclera, the whites of her eyes, had a faint, almost imperceptible yellow tinge. Jaundice, a sign of liver failure. Certain poisons, especially those derived from plants, attack the liver first. Arsenic was a possibility, but Silas was a rancher, a man of the earth. He would use what he knew. Hattie's mind raced through her knowledge of herbs and botany, the very knowledge that had attracted him. She remembered a patch of plants she'd seen growing near the creek that ran through the property. Water hemlock, a beautiful, delicate-looking plant with small white flowers and one of the most violent poisons in North America. Its roots, when crushed and steeped in a tea, would cause a slow, agonizing death that mimicked a wasting sickness. A death with symptoms Silas could pass off as fever. She needed proof. With a small, sharp knife from her sewing kit, she made a tiny, precise incision in Ruthie's side, just over the liver. She extracted a minuscule sample of tissue and wrapped it in a clean handkerchief. It was a long shot, but if her cousin the marshal brought a real doctor with him, that tissue sample could be the final nail in Silas Boone's coffin. She hid the sample with the locket. Her collection of evidence was growing, but so was the risk. Silas was becoming more possessive, more unhinged. He started calling her Elspeth by mistake. He would watch her for hours, his gaze a physical weight. He was losing his grip on the line between the living and the dead. One night she awoke to a sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping coming from Elspeth's room. Hattie crept to her door and listened. It was Silas. He was in there talking. "Soon, my love," he was whispering, his voice a low, cooing murmur. "Soon the family will be whole. The first was a failure, the second a disappointment, but the third is perfect. She understands. She is one of us." The scraping sound continued. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The next day, when she went into the shrine, she saw what he had been doing. On the wall behind Elspeth's bed, he had started carving a name into the wood. Her name, Hattie. He was preparing a place for her, not as a caretaker, as a permanent member of his collection. Time was running out. Her cousin had to be close. He had to be. That Friday when Silas rode to town, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening a storm. He was gone longer than usual. The hours ticked by, each one a lifetime. Hattie paced the floor, the locket and the tissue sample clutched in her hand. Had the diary been found? Had her cousin dismissed it as a prank? The despair was a physical thing, a hand squeezing her heart. Then she heard it, the sound of a horse, not from the direction of town, but from the high mountain pass. It wasn't Silas's steady gelding. This was a faster horse, ridden hard. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through her. She ran to the window. A lone rider was descending the trail, a big man with a broad hat, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. It had to be him. It had to be John Carver. But as the rider drew closer, the hope curdled into ice. It wasn't her cousin. It was the sheriff, Silas's brother. He wasn't riding in a gallop. He was limping his horse along, a dark stain spreading across his thigh. He'd been shot. He saw her in the window and waved frantically, his face pale with panic and pain. He collapsed from his horse just as he reached the porch. Hattie rushed outside. "He's coming!" the sheriff gasped, clutching his bleeding leg. "Your cousin, the marshal. He got the message. He's not alone. They shot me at the pass. Silas sent me ahead to warn you." Hattie stared at him, her mind reeling. "Warn her? Silas. He's not who you think," the sheriff choked out. "He's protecting us. From them." Before she could ask what he meant, another sound echoed from the mountains. A gunshot, then another. They weren't coming for a quiet arrest. They were coming for a war, and she was standing right in the middle of it. The sheriff wasn't here because her cousin was coming. He was here because the people Silas had been killing, they had family too, and they were coming for revenge. "Get inside!" the sheriff yelled, trying to push himself up. "Bolt the door! He's on his way!" Hattie dragged the bleeding man into the house, her mind struggling to process the new, terrifying reality. She had thought Silas was the lone predator, a monster hiding in isolation. But the sheriff's words hinted at something far bigger, a secret shared between the brothers. A war. She slammed the heavy door and threw the bolts. Outside, the wind was picking up, howling like a mourner. Through the window, she could see them now, a handful of riders cresting the ridge, dark figures against the stormy sky. They weren't lawmen. They were rough, hard-faced men with rifles held at the ready. "Who are they?" Hattie demanded, tearing a strip from her petticoat to make a tourniquet for the sheriff's leg. "The Jennings clan," he grunted, his face contorted in pain. "Their girl, Mary. She wasn't the first, or the last. They've been hunting us for months." "Us?" Hattie's voice was sharp. "What did you do?" The sheriff looked away, his gaze falling on the bolted door to Elspeth's room. "It started after Elspeth died. Silas, he changed. He said the world was full of filth, that it was his duty to cleanse it. He targeted people he saw as sinners, travelers, saloon girls, grifters, people no one would miss." Hattie felt a cold dread. This was beyond madness. This was a crusade, a bloody self-righteous war waged from a remote mountain ranch. "And you?" she pressed. "You're the law. You helped him?" "I buried his mistakes," the sheriff whispered, shame and fear warring in his eyes. "I kept the world away. I thought I was protecting my brother, but he went too far. The Jennings, they're not grifters. They're ranchers. They love that girl." A rifle shot cracked, and a pane of glass in the window shattered, spraying the floor. The siege had begun. They were trapped. Suddenly, the sound of another horse, galloping hard, came from the direction of town. Silas. He rode into the yard like a demon, leaping from his horse before it had even stopped, a repeating rifle in his hand. He took cover behind a water trough and returned fire, his shots echoing the riders with deadly accuracy. He saw Hattie in the broken window, and his face was a mask of cold fury. This wasn't the face of a grieving husband or a deranged collector. This was the face of a soldier. "Get my brother to the cellar," he bellowed. "Bar the door." Hattie, moving on pure instinct, helped the sheriff toward a trap door she hadn't noticed behind a bearskin rug. The fight for survival had begun, and her role had shifted once again. She wasn't a victim or a detective anymore. She was a field nurse in a war zone. As she half-carried the groaning sheriff, his words echoed in her mind. He said the world was full of filth. Silas hadn't just been killing for his collection. He saw himself as a purveyor of justice, a righteous man. And in his twisted worldview, the letter she had written, full of quiet strength, resilience, and a touch of lonely melancholy, had marked her not as a caretaker, but as an ally, a kindred spirit. He hadn't been waiting for a new mortician. He'd been waiting for a partner. As she helped the sheriff down the rickety cellar stairs, The smell of damp earth and rotting potatoes filled her nostrils. Then she saw it. Pushed against the far wall of the cellar, behind a stack of empty crates, was a small, crudely made wooden cross, and another next to it, and another. There were at least a half dozen of them. This wasn't just a cellar, it was a crypt. These were the ones the sheriff had buried, the ones no one missed. The front door of the house splintered under the force of a heavy blow. The Jennings clan was breaking through. Upstairs, Silas roared like a wounded animal, his rifle barking a deadly rhythm. Hattie looked at the terrified, bleeding face of the sheriff, at the graves of the forgotten dead, and then toward the sounds of the battle above. She had summoned a posse to catch a killer, but she had instead ignited a war between two families, with herself trapped in the crossfire. There was no good or evil side here, just blood and vengeance. Her cousin, the marshal, was still out there somewhere. But would he arrive in time? And when he did, whose side would he even be on? Hattie closed the cellar door, leaving the sheriff in the dark with his ghosts. She had to get out, but not to run. She had to end this. All of it. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a cold, solid thing in her hand. The cleansing Silas had dreamed of was about to happen. But it would be Hattie Carver, the spinster nurse from Flat Willow, who would be the final angel of judgment. The house had become a slaughterhouse. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood. The Jennings men were inside now, their heavy boots thudding on the floorboards, their shouts mingling with Silas's enraged roars. Hattie crouched behind an overturned love seat, the iron poker clutched in her hands, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't her fight, but she was the one who had lit the fuse. She had to find a way to extinguish it before it consumed them all. From her hiding place, she could see the grim tableau unfolding. Two of the Jennings men lay dead or dying in the entryway. A third was locked in a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle with Silas near the door to Elspeth's shrine. They were two bulls, powerful and enraged, trading blows that would kill a lesser man. Silas was a force of nature, driven by his righteous madness. But the Jennings man was fueled by a father's grief and rage. It was a stalemate of pure fury. Hattie knew she had only one chance. She had to create a diversion, something so shocking it would break the spell of violence. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the oil lamps. And then her gaze fell on the door to Elspeth's room, the shrine, the heart of Silas's madness. With a surge of adrenaline, Hattie scrambled from behind the love seat. She snatched an oil lamp from a side table, ignoring the shouts as the men spotted her. She ran not for the exit, but straight for the bolted door. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she threw her shoulder against it. The wood groaned. Silas, seeing what she was about to do, let out a guttural scream of pure rage. "No!" He threw the Jennings man aside as if he were a sack of flour and lunged for her. But he was too late. Hattie crashed through the door, stumbling into the musty, chemical-scented darkness of the shrine. She didn't hesitate. She ripped the top off the lamp, sloshing oil over the lace-covered bed, over the dried flowers, over the waxy, serene face of the dead bride, Elspeth. The corpse, soaked in 20 years of flammable preservatives, was a perfect kindling. "You will not have her!" Silas shrieked from the doorway, his face a mask of horror. "She is mine!" "She was never yours," Hattie said, her voice ringing with a clarity and power she had never felt before. "She is free." She struck a match from the box she kept in her pocket and tossed it onto the bed. The world erupted in flame. The corpse of Elspeth went up like a torch, a whoosh of orange and black fire that sucked the air from the room. The chemical-soaked silks and linens ignited instantly, and the shrine became an inferno. The sight was horrifying and magnificent. The fire of justice. The heat and smoke poured into the main room, momentarily stunning the combatants. The spell was broken. The Jennings man stared, his mouth agape, at the pyre that had once been a woman. Silas, however, only had eyes for Hattie. His rage at her blasphemy transcended everything else. He charged into the burning room, heedless of the flames, his hands outstretched like claws to throttle the life from her. But Hattie was ready. As he lunged, she swung the heavy iron poker with all her might. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. The giant of a man staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief. He touched his head, his fingers coming away bloody. He looked at her, not with hatred, but with a profound, wounded confusion. "You were supposed to understand," he whispered. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed onto the floor, the edge of his coat catching fire from the burning bed. The fire was spreading fast now, licking up the dry timber walls of the house. The remaining Jennings men, their vengeance forgotten in the face of the inferno, scrambled for the exit. Hattie stood for a moment, breathing in the smoke, watching the flames consume the house of horrors. She had done it. She had cleansed this place. She started to turn, to make her own escape, when a new sound cut through the roar of the fire. A whistle, sharp and clear. Lawman. She stumbled out of the burning house, choking and soot-covered, just as a posse of a half-dozen riders galloped into the yard. At their head was a tall, grim-faced man with kind eyes and a familiar jawline. John Carver, her cousin, the marshal. He swung down from his horse and ran to her, his face a mixture of relief and horror. "Hattie? My God, what happened here?" Hattie couldn't speak. She just pointed back at the burning house, a funeral pyre for a family's madness. She looked at the bodies in the yard, at the smoke pouring into the stormy sky. Her message had been received, but the justice that arrived was not the clean, simple justice of a courtroom. It was the chaotic, fiery justice of the frontier. She had survived. But as she looked at the carnage around her, at the destruction she had unleashed, she wondered if the quiet, invisible woman named Hattie Carver had burned away in that fire too, leaving someone else entirely in her place. The aftermath was a blur of smoke and rain. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, a cold, cleansing downpour that hissed against the embers of the Boone Ranch. It couldn't save the house, which collapsed into a black, skeletal ruin, but it stopped the fire from spreading to the barn and the surrounding forest. John Carver's men rounded up the surviving Jennings clan members, their fight extinguished, their faces blank with shock and exhaustion. The wounded sheriff was pulled from the cellar, alive but broken, his story tumbling out in a rambling, incoherent confession. And Hattie sat on a log, wrapped in a blanket, a tin cup of coffee warming her trembling hands. She told her cousin everything: the stolen letter, the gruesome shrine, Ruthie's diary, the graves in the cellar. She showed him the locket and the precious, damning tissue sample she still had clutched in her hand. John listened, his face growing grimmer with every word. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, looking at the smoldering ruin where Silas Boone and his bride had been consumed. "You did what you had to do, Hat," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "You did what the law couldn't. You brought justice to this mountain." But it didn't feel like justice. It felt like war. She had walked into a monster's lair, and to survive, she had been forced to become a monster herself. She had desecrated a grave, set a fire, and watched a man die. The quiet nurse who loved quilting was gone forever. They found what was left of Silas and Elspeth in the ashes. The fire had welded them together in a final, grotesque embrace. They buried them in a single unmarked grave alongside the Jennings men who had died in the raid. When it was all over days later, John Carver offered her a place in Helena. "You can't go back to Flat Willow," he said. "Not after this. You need a new start." Hattie considered it. A new city, a new life, a chance to forget the horrors she had seen. But as she looked out over the quiet, rain-washed mountains, she realized she wasn't the same woman who had ridden up that trail. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't invisible. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I'm not running. This place, it took my sister. It almost took me. I won't let it win." She decided to stay. Not at the Boone Ranch, which was now nothing more than a haunted patch of scorched earth, but in the nearby town of Flat Willow. At first, the townsfolk were suspicious. They whispered about the fire, about the woman who had survived the notorious Silas Boone. But Hattie didn't cower. She held her head high. She opened a small nursing clinic in the center of town. She used her hands not to tend to the dead, but to bring new life into the world, to soothe fevers, to mend broken bones. She was good at it. She was good at mending things. Her story, whispered at first, became a local legend. She wasn't the spinster, the leftover. She was Hattie Carver, the woman who burned down a monster's house, the woman who survived. She never married. She never sought out love. The quiet life she once thought was a curse now felt like a blessing, a peace she had earned in the heart of the fire. Years later, a young writer came to town, collecting stories of the Old West. He came to her small clinic and asked her about the legend of Silas Boone. Hattie, now an old woman with eyes that had seen too much, simply smiled. Some stories are best left in the ashes, she said, because her story wasn't about the monster she had faced. It was about the woman she had become. It was a story of survival, of quiet strength, and of a resilience that she never knew she had. A resilience that had been there all along, hidden in a letter she was once too afraid to send. It turned out she was the marrying kind after all. She had married herself, her own strength, her own courage. And that was a love that no fire could ever destroy. This story is a testament to the fact that the quietest people often have the strongest wills. Hattie Carver was overlooked her whole life, but when it mattered most, she found a fire inside her that was hotter than any pyre. She faced down pure evil and didn't just survive, she won. What do you think? Did Hattie do the right thing by taking justice into her own hands? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this trip into the dark heart of the Old West, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. We've got a lot more dark trails to explore together. Thanks for watching.